Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the New York trip, which we have just come back from, and the relation of what we have said on the New York trip, what we have seen to the economic syllabus. So, first thing we're going to talk about is the Rockefeller Building and Standard Oil. Now, John Rockefeller, the person who was responsible for a lot of the funding of the Rockefeller Building, was also in charge of Standard Oil. Now, the Rockefeller Building would have cost $1.6 billion in 2021 terms to build. And so, therefore, he must have been in charge of an enterprise with very significant supernormal profits to enable him to do that. And that enterprise was Standard Oil. Standard Oil gained significant monopoly power, and it's really interesting to see how it did that. So it did that, fundamentally, it supplied oil, and of course to do that you need to transport it. So in order to do that, it used canals, it used pipelines, and it used train lines. Now, I think by the late 19th century, it controlled most of the pipelines in the US. It also had contracts with train companies, which allowed exclusive access to their railroads. And so by doing that, they cut out the competition, and it allowed them to significantly drop prices. For example, kerosene prices fell from 58 to 26 cents from 1865 to 1870. So clearly this was really beneficial for consumers. There was a gain of transport economies of scale because of it. Long-run average costs would have fallen, and that allowed them to knock out the competition in that way, which you may see as a fair way of competing. However, they also went for vertical integration, which was the oil company buying the refinery, and they were forced refineries to sell their businesses to them by cutting them off the pipelines. Given that they owned the pipelines, they were able to threaten those refineries, and once they had control of the refineries, then clearly they could say to the other oil companies, then you can't use my refinery, or you could give them less favorable terms. So again, it's about cornering the market and preventing competition in what we could see there is unfair ways. They also use predatory pricing, dropping prices below their competition in certain regions, and then knocking out the competition in that way. And by doing all these things, it ended up owning 88% or controlling 88% of the market of refined oil flows in the US by 1890. So very, very strong monopoly power, and of course, therefore, very, very large earnings for John Rockefeller. We think that, or it has been estimated that Standard Oil would be worth $1 trillion in real terms if it was still one company today. And it is not one company because of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that restricted its operations in 1890 and broke it up into all of these different separate oil firms. And some of the oil firms that we know today, for example, ExxonMobil and Chevron, came out of those split up companies. So, for example, ExxonMobil coming from Standard Oil of New Jersey and Chevron coming from Standard Oil of California. Fantastic. I'd like to talk about Google offices now. And what did we see from the Google office? Well, I think one thing that really surprised us was the rate of pay that Google engineers and managers are on. We asked one of the Google engineers how much they were on, and he said $220 or $230,000 per year. Again, the interns or those on apprenticeships in their first year sounded as though they were on close to $100,000 as well. So clearly, this is a very, very highly skilled business which is using workers which have a very high marginal revenue product. That is the case that each of these workers must be generating far more than their yearly salary in earnings for Google to allow Google to pay them this much. That just makes logical sense from what we've learned. So in that case, productivity is very, very important for Google, given the fact that it has very, very high MRP of its workers. It could further that, if it further improved its productivity just by 10%, for example, that would have a very big impact on its revenue and average costs. So we can say that productivity is the output for a given number of inputs. And again, productivity crucial for Google's success. Now, why are workers so productive? Well, they are combined with very significant amount of capital. The servers, the technology that Google has allows its workers to create products. A limited number of workers, actually. I think we heard over 10,000 workers at the Google New York offices, but they're able to create an incredible number of products given they are leveraged through technology. And So the question for Google then is, how do they make them more productive? And is it worth doing it? Well, it would be worth doing these things if the cost of these interventions were less than the increased revenue product that they would achieve from doing it. And clearly the fact that they've done it means that the revenue product that they gain from it is far greater than the cost. So they have provided free food and amenable spaces to get teams to work together and stay at Google for longer. Innovative hiring practices, the AI-based interviews, for example. The first rounds of the interviews can sift out a huge number of candidates using TikTok as their hiring tool, generating probably very, very high numbers of applications for each of their jobs, allowing them to get the absolute best talent for each role, allowing them therefore to become more productive as they create better teams. Regular training and rotation, the 20% projects allowing creativity. For example, I think YouTube came from a 20% project, possibly Gmail as well. And the matrix team organization, project-based flexible teams, all of those things really driving productivity. And if we're driving productivity, that allows us to spread the same number of workers over a greater output, therefore reducing Google's average costs and therefore allowing it to make greater profit, but greater supernormal profit. Now, I just was quite interested by this. I took this in the toilet, and this was just a little, I suppose a key to increasing productivity. It was saying if you build a bridge, build one side first open that, and then start the other side, rather than building both at the same time. That's called swarming, and that allows its workers to be able to be trained better to deliver products quicker to market and therefore generate revenue more quickly. Again, increasing the productivity of its workers, or the impact of that productivity, I suppose I should say. Now, this relates to the labour market unit, the demand and supply of labour. The demand of labour linking back to the marginal revenue product, and the supply of labour linking back to the fact that many workers would probably be willing to work at this firm. And from what I heard from you, you were all very, very excited about working at Google. And clearly, that allows them to generate very, very high levels of applications for their job roles. Clearly, wage determination as well. The labour market equilibrium is a function of its demand and supply. It's very high MRP, and probably actually for each role they do have a limited supply given the high training requirements for each of those roles. Now, interestingly, Google has 39% of global advertising revenues, and therefore it has a similar position, although far less, than Standard Oil. So we could make a comparison between them. Now, traditionally, we've thought that monopoly is a negative effect, and clearly has a negative effect on consumers. We know that consumer surplus is limited to this hatched area up there, and as the monopoly company is taking this supernormal profit, which would have originally existed as consumer surplus, away from consumers, and therefore we may comment that Google and Standard Oil have a negative effect on the market, justifying the Sherman Antitrust Act and other possible litigation against Google. Now, one argument that we could give here is actually they have reduced prices, and we know that we saw for kerosene that prices fell, and we also know that for Google they provide lots of free products for consumers, although that, interestingly, isn't actually their product. Their product is advertising, but they may be able to provide a really quality service for their clients, which are businesses who want to target certain consumers. Now, it may well be that we've learned about perfect competition. We know that perfect competition produces where supply is equal to demand. But they also are small. They have no innovation and they have no economies of scale. Now, what if Standard Oil and Google have very, very, very high levels of innovation and technology and so on, allowing its supply curve S equals MC with, and I'll just say with EOS, with economies of scale and innovation? What if that were very, very significant? Well, clearly it was. But this firm, as the industry, will produce where MC, the profit maximizing level of output, MC equals MR. And because it's a monopoly, we could argue that it is the industry. Now, it's not quite in Standard Oil, and it wasn't in Google either. But theoretically, we could put it there. Resulting in, even though they have monopoly power, they would be able to charge lower prices than the perfectly competitive firm. And as a result, consumer surplus would actually be greater by this area here than if they were in perfect competition. So you may argue that it's actually overall beneficial. Right, we went to Morgan Stanley and Bank of America, and we learnt about the role of financial markets. Financial markets allocating financial capital, and the relevance of this to economics is that it is a very, very large potential to create economic growth. Directing investment into the most effective use to the most efficient firms allows the economy to grow more quickly, generating productivity, but also limiting it and taking it away from firms who are not going to use it wisely. Now, clearly, there are also risks of overly risky behavior and issues where firms may lend irresponsibly, and that may require government intervention. And clearly Morgan Stanley and Bank of America after 2008 were both affected by this. I've downloaded the 8 pillars of the things that they do, and I'll just put it up here for you to read through if you wish. Clearly, they provide very, very important services to global markets, to companies, and to people and institutions. Now, we saw a little bit more in Morgan Stanley about business objectives, and I thought this was really interesting. And we have an area of the course which is, what is a business objective? What are the objectives of firms? And well, clearly the main objective is profit maximization, and we saw that very clearly within Morgan Stanley, within Bank of America, and within Google. But it was interesting to hear about the fact that they supported a coffee vendor during the pandemic, and how that impacted on its core values. Now, you may say that, Morgan Stanley are actually just very nice people, and they just did it because they were charitable. But if you think about this carefully, how much would it cost Morgan Stanley to do that? And who is impacted by it? Well, clearly, when you think about it, it's trying to create a set of core values which communicates to its staff, which creates a sense of belonging in a team, and it possibly hopes that their team members seeing that will then imitate that behavior. And you could then say, actually, it's a very cheap way of developing a set of values for the company, given that everyone used that coffee vendor. It's actually a very clever thing to do because the Google staff are very aware of it. We also heard about inclusion and diversity, which I wasn't sure about, given the fact that they are hiring from very clearly defined talent pools. I think they talked about the 4 or 5 schools, the top-rate schools that they are hiring from, for example, Notre Dame we heard about. And so a question for Morgan Stanley may be its hiring practices in comparison to Google. How is that creating different levels of productivity, and how does that affect the business as a whole? Now, we haven't learned about this, but this is the area which is going to be taught in the next month or so, the role of financial markets. And this is exactly what these banks are doing. They're creating markets for equities, they're helping firms to raise capital, they are facilitating the circular flow of income, allowing economic growth. Also, though, they are creating lots of potential problems within markets through externalities, through overlending, and the government having to bail them out if they get it wrong. Now, I have a couple more. I've got a minute left. Just a few things to say about the legal institutions. It was really interesting to hear about the insurance industry pooling risk, the role of corporate litigation in reducing uncertainty. And those two things, if you think about it, actually institutions are incredibly important for the growth and development of an economy. And those two things allow firms to have a view of the future, an expectation of the future of what that might be like. They're able to know that contracts will be fulfilled. And so you may well say that that increases investment. It was also interesting to hear Judge Klott talking about the role of criminal law. And he was talking about the idea of locking people up to protect the rest. And you could say that actually public law, criminal law, is actually a public good. It's non-excludable. When you lock someone up, everyone is helped. It's non-rivalrous. Everyone benefits from it. And the more I use of it, it doesn't reduce the amount for anyone else. We also learnt about H&K strategies, which you could link to demand. And you could link to consumer behavior, which is actually behind so much of what we learn in economics. I don't have time to talk about that, But I hope you could think about it, think about the things I put on there,